It's so wonderful to be here with you this evening. We wish we could be together here in person at the museum. I'm sitting just adjacent to our Lyceum, where we've had so many wonderful forums over the past couple of years since the new Rasmussen Education Center opened, and we hope to have many more. But of course, due to the pandemic, our forums will be held virtually for the next few months, and we want to thank you all so much for joining from home. Our museum offices have just reopened. We've been here for a couple of weeks, and we are looking forward to reopening our galleries in early August. One piece of good news is we've extended the run of our current temporary exhibit, Beyond Midnight, Paul Revere and His Ride, through Columbus Day. So if you haven't seen the exhibit, or if you came to the opening and saw it and want to bring your friends back, again, we will be opening in August with timed tickets, a limited number of individuals in the museum and gallery. And we hope you will come and see the exhibit. We had planned this for this forum to be held this spring, and we are pleased that it will be able to have it this evening. I want to thank our manager of public programs, Allison Schilling, who has organized all of these events. We'll be sending you updates soon on our programs in July and August. If you chimed in early, you would have seen that we have two events. One, a former colleague of mine, Dolores Johnson, has written a new memoir about the biracial family that she grew up in, and really her mother's story, leaving Indianapolis or Indiana and marrying an African-American man and living in upstate New York, and how Dolores found out just about how heart-wrenching decision that was for her mother to make. And then Sandy Petrolinas, who many of you have perhaps seen speak here before, will be speaking about the role women played in obtaining the right to vote, the women of Concord. And we are doing that in conjunction with the centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment, which, as you know, happened in late August. The centennial celebration will happen this year. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by two colleagues from the Paul Revere Memorial Association, which runs the Paul Revere House in the North End. First, Nina Zinieri is the executive director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, a post she has held since 1986. That's 34 years for anyone who's counting. I've churned through a year of graduate school and 8 jobs over that span of time. She's a national leader in the museum world, having served as the vice chair of the American Alliance for Museums, the president of the New England Museum Association, and the recipient of the New England Museum Association Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015. She's also been a mentor, a friend, and a confidant to me. It's been a joy, as always, to work and collaborate with her on this new exhibit. And I especially appreciated an opportunity to go down to New York City when the exhibit was at the New York Historical Society, and she and Robert did a forum similar to this one at that venue. Robert Schimpf is the Research and Adult Program Director for the Paul Revere Memorial Association. He received his PhD from Boston University, having written his dissertation on John Quincy Adams. He's the recipient of several fellowships and awards, and he currently serves as the editor for the Revere House Gazette, the Revere Express blog, and Revere House Radio. We truly could not be in better hands to look at the life and legend of Paul Revere than to be with Nina and Robert this evening. So if the technology cooperates, we're going to watch a conversation that we filmed last week. Please send in your questions during the conversation via the chat feature if you're watching on YouTube Live, which I think many of you are, and Allison and I will collect them. And then Nina and Robert will join us live at the end of the program, and I will ask your questions to them at that time. We think the whole program will run about an hour. So without further ado, let's watch this conversation together. The program
to the Concord Museum and see it, and then rush to the Worcester Art Museum because it's a great show. With regard to Revere, I mean, we're pretty comfortable that he would have had a fair amount of local fame. He wouldn't have been a national rock star probably to the extent that he is, but there are things about Revere that would have endured. His silver really holds up, and he certainly would have been known as a wonderful Boston and probably national silversmith in that regard. There's also the fact that he did leave a trail. There are a lot of records that he left behind, business records that got kept by the Mass Historical Society, and the Belknap letter that went to the Mass Historical Society as well. And so at some point, people might have picked up on those threads. And I know that Robert has thought a lot about that piece of this.
Yeah, and I just echo Nina. Thanks for having us, Tom. It's really exciting to be able to pull this together in this format. Yeah, I think the question's interesting too, and thinking about the threads that Revere did leave. Let's say Longfellow's out of the equation. We're obviously talking Civil War era there. But Revere was well known, or at least known enough in Boston generally. But to Nina's point, in 1798, he had worked with Jeremy Belknap at the founding of the Massachusetts Historical Society and wrote a more detailed version of his writing. He'd written a few shorter ones in 1775, but he wrote a more detailed one in 1798. So it strikes me that that document in particular, I think, really would have been of great interest to researchers around the centennial celebrations in 1876 and certainly the build-up in 75. And if not then, certainly at a time when more folks were getting into archives and researching generally for the bicentennial celebrations around 75 and 76 in the 20th century. So I think that's almost an interesting counterfactual to how Revere, perhaps even more accurately than the Longfellow poem did, might have found his way into general histories and scholarship of the Revolution through his words rather than the rather romantic telling of Longfellow that certainly has given the general public a maybe sometimes skewed version of events, but has certainly broadened him out to audiences that otherwise would not have happened.
And I'll go back to Revere in a second, but I'm curious about the house. I mean, why was the house preserved, in those, say, in the early 19th century? That was before Longfellow's poem, right? And Revere's notoriety. So just give us a quick history of why the house was preserved the way it was throughout the last couple of centuries.
Well, the house was, as you note, in fact, known as his home certainly by the 1840s, before the poem. But it really doesn't get much attention until 1895 when the DAR puts a plaque on the house. And at that point, the neighborhood is beginning to transition into perhaps grittier neighborhood. A lot of the affluent people have moved out. It's a classic urban story. And the family, out of some concern, there is a 1901 fire in the basement that doesn't do much damage. The family steps forward, and John Phillips Reynolds purchased the house. He wasn't planning on supporting the whole restoration. They did a campaign. Local people came forward, politicians, and it opened, was restored in 1907, opened in 1908. And interestingly, at that time, both John Phillips Reynolds and Pauline Revere Thayer, who were both great-grandchildren of Paul Revere, particularly Pauline, had an interest in immigrant communities. She worked educating immigrant communities, and they all thought the house would be a nice example of American values for immigrant communities. It's probably not exactly the way we'd say it now, but I think it was born of some good intentions. In an urban environment, of course, it would also have been threatened. And if the family hadn't stepped up, it probably would have gone the way of many older buildings in heavily settled urban neighborhoods where they just get torn down to accommodate larger buildings.
And when does it actually become a museum or historic house that people begin to visit?
April 18th, 1908.
Ah, fascinating.
Good date.
Let's go back to the Longfellow poem. So, on one hand, Revere can, his great mantle as a national figure comes from the poem. And yet, on the other hand, maybe the poem does a slight disservice to the story because it does have this kind of solitary hero, this David versus Goliath. maybe you could just touch upon how much of that story and that is at the heart of the myth, and does that do a disservice to Revere, or is it more a disservice in general to the history of the moment? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the poem does, in both a disservice to Revere, but also I think in a sense, I think limits his significance in a different way, is that Revere wasn't this solitary figure. He's not on the other side of the Charles waiting for these lanterns to spring out into the night himself. There were other writers that night. There were both proximal writers from Boston. Of course, William Dawes is probably most known to folks when they think of someone else besides Revere, but it was even more complicated than just Dawes. We're talking a system of networks of writers going through the countryside, essentially getting back to that concept of the Minutemen by Lexington and Concord. How does one turn out? You have to have an elaborate system. And Revere was central to that system. He was an important cog, as he had been for several years prior to the Revolution, starting rides the night of, or morning after, depending on how you look at it, the Boston Tea Party on December 17, 1773. He established himself as a writer, and he was instrumental from Boston to put together these networks that essentially were fail-safes, because he knew the mission that he was on and famous for now on April 18th was too important to leave to one individual. There needed to be fail-safes, there needed to be multiples at various stages. So I think one of the things that the poem does is doesn't necessarily give him enough credit, and the Sons of Liberty more broadly construed, enough credit for the complex system that had been put into place and ultimately allowed for success that night.
So Robert, why don't you just tell us again, and also, as you indicated, but tell us a little bit more. It makes it, we think of him just doing that one ride, but there were other rides that he had done before April 19th, 1775. Maybe you could just comment on a couple of those.
Sure, yeah. So I think the one that really does stand out to me most is the day after the Tea Party on December 17th of 73. So Revere, I always like to say, if he was there, and there's debate on what Revere's level of action and participation was at the Tea Party, we do know that he definitely made the ride the next day. So if he was at the Tea Party, he was definitely one of the more sober figures there, because he was able to get on the horse. And he got down to New York in very good time after that, actually. And essentially at that point, I think it became clear, and it had already been clear for several years to many of the folks in Boston, that this was going to be an information battle more than anything else. That really raised the stakes for Revere's ride. Getting down to New York in good time, he would make multiple rides down to New York and even down to Philadelphia in the years leading up to his ride. He carried the Suffolk Resolve, of course, the important document of 74, to the Continental Congress. He made a famous ride up to Portsmouth in terrible conditions to warn of what ended up being a bit of a faulty information situation in 74 with British troops heading up to New Hampshire, and had made a ride out to Concord and Lexington just a few days before his more famous ride to kind of scope things out, get the lay of the land, and knew that ride had to be, again, put in with fail-safes involved. So he was a trusted writer, and he's somebody who had really built up a reputation for himself within the broader organization of the Sons of Liberty from very late 1773 up through April of 1775.
And in David Hackett Fisher's book, in the Portsmouth one, especially when they know that it's Revere who's ridden up with the alarm, Fisher wonders why General Gage didn't arrest him, and why not? Here's this guy who's going out and ruining all of our missions. Had he done so on April 19th, perhaps the story would have been different. Do you have a sense of why Revere wasn't arrested?
Yeah, I think that's one of the counterfactuals, and really, depending on how you view the revolution, perhaps one of the major failings of Gage is that had he gone in with a hard hand, had he arrested a lot of the central figures, we're talking more the Hancock, the Adamses, but maybe more not at the upper echelon of political leadership, but some of these middling leaders like Revere, that could have snuffed out the revolution. But Gage, I think, for a lot of reasons, was hesitant to do so. It was unprecedented generally at the time. It was certainly unprecedented in the North American colonies to go in with a heavy hand. And I think in a lot of ways, Gage really came to feel trapped by the situation and by his role, which, as we see after April 18th, literally happened as the siege of Boston commenced after that. So it was a really tricky situation. I think the counterfactual is right. I think there's a way in which a heavy hand really could have ended things, but at the same time, you see the reasons for Gage's hesitancy throughout, and that's certainly one of the reasons that Revere was able to exist. And just as a final point on that, and to your point, Tom, Revere was known. His name was in London papers. He was referenced as an ambassador from Massachusetts to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So he would have been one of those middling figures that would have been, certainly on the radar for Gage had he proceeded that way. But as we know, he didn't, and things went Revere's way on April 18th.
And just a practical question. Was it always the same horse? Was he borrowing horses? Was he a good horseman by nature? Or, I mean, clearly he's riding everywhere. And how does that work?
Well, I have often said that two things. If Revere were alive today, he'd probably use Zipcar. And at the time, it was about as difficult and expensive to keep a horse in Boston as it is a car now. So Revere, there is a record that he may have owned a horse at one time. We don't believe he did at the time of the Revolution. He was borrowing horses and essentially ride a horse, go to a stable, change horses, and ride on. So you were using up your horses. And in fact, the poor Larkin family never gets their horse back because it gets taken away from him. And
that's the April 19th horse.
Exactly. So there's also all these issues about what was the name of the horse. And we don't even know if people named their horses. But if he's riding borrowed horses, perhaps he didn't even stop to ask, what's my horse's name tonight? So we really don't know.
So Robert, you talked about the Sons of Liberty, and no, in this case, let's not assume that everyone knows. Both, he was a member of the Sons of Liberty and the Freemasons. Talk about those two associations and what they meant for who he was and how he was connected within the Boston community.
Yeah, Revere, one of the really interesting things about Revere, and one of the things that I've really had an idea of this coming into the Paul Revere House, but it just always strikes me more and more how connected this guy was to the various facets of Boston society at the time. So we're thinking a town, roughly speaking, around 15,000 people at the Revolution, and you can draw any number of threads and connect Revere all over the town. For the Sons of Liberty, Revere, as we say, was one of these kind of middling leaders of the Sons of Liberty. As an artisan, as a silversmith, as an engraver, he was able to, I think, toss his weight around for his artisan community, mechanics, as they would have been called at the time. And we see this in a way that Revere becomes, I think, interwoven, certainly in the Sons of Liberty, making these rides, making prominent engravings, but in increasingly more closed off circles. So he's not only part of the Sons of Liberty, but then an offshoot of the Sons of Liberty, he's a member of the North End Caucus, which is a more exclusive group. And then even one of the more closed off that we really don't know much about, groups of the Sons of Liberty, even almost a secondary, getting into tertiary groups, is the Long Room Club, which had about 17 members, Revere being one of the only artisans of that. So it's through those circles that he's interacting more directly with Sam Adams, with John Hancock, at times John Adams as well, while of course still conveying the needs and issues of his, we could say, constituents, essentially. And it was through those groups that Revere, especially the more increasingly closed off groups, that Revere and his artisans and mechanics were able to, and as you said, late 74, essentially put on nightly patrols of roving groups of 2 individuals from these groups, and would report back to the leaders, Hancock, Adams, at that time, Dr. Benjamin Church, which turned out to be incredibly problematic since he was a spy for the British at the time. But we see Revere being able to work his way into smaller groups and both assert his authority in ways that he could upwards, and certainly assert it downwards too in Boston society. So I think getting to the Sons of Liberty, that really harnesses the significance of Revere's various occupations and his constant presence in Boston throughout his life, really. And certainly going back to the Freemason part, that's something, Nina, that he had really from his early days and some of his earliest times in getting into professional circles in Boston.
And so you touched upon it, you calling him a middling figure, but let's just talk briefly about social class. You know, he's not as wealthy as John Hancock. He's not going to Boston Latin or Harvard. Get some schooling, but then is trained as an artist. And was there a limit to how far he could grow? Is that why we don't consider him, like, he wasn't an intellectual leader per se? Long-winded question, but you know, some have compared him to Benjamin Franklin, but Franklin, you know, who has again some of these mechanical, technical skills too, also broadens and earns that mantle of kind of a founding father. So the general question I'll just throw out to the two of you.
I'm going to let Robert speak to Benjamin Franklin, but for Revere, I'm always struck by the fact that there are all these moments in his life where he is confounded by his social class. He may think of himself as really smart and capable, but every once in a while, something will stop him. At the time of the Revolution, he was really disappointed that he didn't get a commission into the Continental Army. He thought that's what would happen. Instead, he gets a not very good Massachusetts train of artillery position. Later on, after the Revolution, he expects that he's going to reap some reward for what he's done, this great service that he's given. Even though his military service isn't great, he feels that he's contributed, and he thinks, boy, I would make a great director of the mint. I'm qualified, I've worked with currency, and he presents himself as a candidate, and he gets back a letter that doesn't directly say this, but basically says, Revere, you're not the right sort. And he sees that he's not going to overcome that social issue. So what it does with Revere, I think, is it really drives him. It drives him to be the best that he can be within the circumstances that are presented to him. And he actually exceeds those circumstances. The only thing he ever got was he was named Suffolk County Coroner, which is an absurd position for, you would think, Paul Revere, coroner. But he had an interest in medical things, and it's really writing down the circumstances of a death. So it's drunk man takes long walk off short pier, drowns. But Robert can talk a little bit about the difference, I think, between Revere and Franklin, which is instructive.
And before you do, Robert, I mean, that what you just described, you know, it really is the kind of quintessential American story. You know what I mean? It's someone who's somewhat immigrant, somewhat held back, but strives. And I read in one of your publications that while he did okay financially during his life, it wasn't until really the end where he really did become wealthy towards the end of his professional career.
And he does that based on his abilities with metals and his ability to be in the right spot at the right time, which is really, it's both a bootstrap story, but it also, I think, speaks to his native intelligence. He was a really smart guy. He was able to drive through things that he was fascinated with, and metals were one of those things. He was really there with the whole copper business.
Yeah, I'll go to that a little bit later, but Robert, we'll throw the Benjamin Franklin comparison to you.
Yeah, I know it's an interesting one for a few reasons. I think to the point that Nina just made, I think both of them very much throughout their lives were autodidacts of sorts, being able to pick up pieces of of something that they've read about or heard about or had some secondary information on and work through it and create from there. So I think that the comparison's really apt. The timing here is interesting too, Tom. Based off of the recent novella run in the Boston Globe, The Mechanics by Ben Mesrich, in which he does draw a lot of these direct connections and really leave. You don't want to give too much away here for folks that haven't read it, but there's a very strong, shall we say, connection between Franklin and Revere towards the end of the piece. I think that the differences are actually quite significant between them. I think timing is important. Franklin's about 20 years older than Revere. So I think the time at which Franklin was breaking into society and into politics. It was a fundamentally different era than the time that Revere was doing it. It was a little bit more porous at the time. I think the stakes were a little bit less, and I think Franklin was able to, he had avenues open to him just simply by chronology that Revere would not. I think the experiences of their youth was very different. Franklin was far more of a cosmopolitan from his youth than Revere was. We have Franklin, swimming around the Thames as a late teenager, early 20s. So he's seen the empire and seen the politics first off in ways that Revere really did not through his entire life. I think the mediums that they used would have been quite significant in terms of, or is significant in thinking about the differences between the men. I think Revere's, Silver tells us a great deal of him, but as an engraver, he was mostly a borrower. He wasn't really necessarily an innovator in terms of the pieces most directly connected to the revolution that we think of Revere. Really, for Silver, the only political piece necessarily was the Liberty Bowl that he did in 1768. Most of his political stances came in his engravings, whereas Franklin's, of course, producing more printed materials. He's writing more. He's producing more, and I think that allowed him to think politically and enter political circles earlier than Revere did. But there's a lot more to this question. It's one I really haven't given much thought to this point. So I think it's a really meaty question that can be taken in a lot of different directions.
I should note at the beginning that for those who do come to see the exhibit, that a portion of it is here and a portion of it is at the Worcester Art Museum. The whole show had been at the New York Historical. And I'm focusing primarily on the revolutionary story, and the Worcester Art Museum is focusing more on Revere as a craftsperson and an entrepreneur. And so I said I wasn't going to go over the whole April 19th story. And I referenced and asked earlier why Gage didn't arrest Revere. But to me, one of the most fascinating parts of the story, and I don't think it's as well known to many because it is an in Longfellow's poem. And Longfellow's poem, Revere makes it here to Concord, where I'm sitting, is when Revere is captured and how he actually essentially talks his captors into releasing him, which allows him to actually be back in Lexington for the battle. But can one of you just recount again the heightened tension of that moment when Revere actually was captured and how he managed essentially to get himself released?
Yeah, it's really the whole tale is really one of those great moments. As I'm sure much of the audience here tonight knows. I mean, one of those really great distillations of a lot of events happening in a short amount of time. And the capture story is interesting because definitionally, Revere did finish his ride. His mission was to get to Lexington, and he did. He finished his ride. Now, after Dawes arrives and they refresh themselves for a time, they decide essentially to press on to Concord. At that stage, they meet up with Dr. Samuel Prescott, as we know. We have the three riders. The one, Prescott, of course, that knows the terrain a little bit more, is able to make it to Concord. And we have a couple of fits and starts with Revere almost getting away and then running into a larger patrol as Dawes is able to avoid himself. And I think the real upshot for me in this exchange is, to some extent, Revere certainly under great duress. He has a gun pointed to his head, threatened to have his brains blown out a few times in this exchange. And what he's able to do is essentially give his captors almost more information about what's going on that night than they know themselves. He's able to convince them that Revere knows what he's talking about, that he knows more about the movements of certainly both the Minutemen and of the soldiers coming from Boston that night, and is able to convince them, you don't want to deal with me. There's a whole lot more going on this night. And of course, when they hear some of the preliminary warm-ups from Lexington Green, that's really when they decide to let this guy go. But getting back to the poor Larkins and their horse is taken from him. So he's got to walk all the way back on foot to Lexington, which ends up being a whole kind of other interesting story that develops there once he makes it back to the Green. But a few very tense hours for Revere there as he's with a few others, but is able to essentially talk his way out of it.
Go ahead and tell us what happens on the Green. I think that would be interesting to people when he gets back to Lexington.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those, also one of those moments in history where we have this whole moment for Revere. He makes it back. He gets there. He finds Hancock and Adams and their crew essentially where they were when he left them hours ago, which must have frustrated him to no end to see that going on. They eventually make their way on, but Revere and Hancock's secretary realize Hancock's trunk with we don't know what, and this is also not to really be a spoiler here, but for a couple of pitches here for the Mechanic in the Globe recently, a trunk with sensitive documents. We see it reported as such many times over to the historical record, important documents, sensitive documents. So Revere and Hancock's secretary are able to remove the trunk to the woods to a safe place just before the first shots ring out, what would be the Battle of Lexington Green. But it's at that moment where I think we get a lot of these counterfactuals. We get a lot of what ifs, because that's where the story essentially more or less for Revere drops off that night.
Well, I was going to ask about that. So what does he do that day? Is he in Lexington? So again, the troops come to Concord, and then they have to march back through Lexington, and they're getting attacked on all sides. Where is, Revere on that afternoon? Does he witness the retreat, or has he moved on?
Well, part of the problem with Revere is there is no Hollywood ending to this part of the story. He sort of disappears. He shows up again in Watertown. There's been a little suspicion he might have tried to sneak back into Boston to see his family, but we think that probably was too dangerous. And we have the association recently acquired a letter that had been known, but we didn't know where it was. It's a letter from Paul to Rachel, trying to get her set up to come and join him in Watertown, which is where he shows up. And again, Revere is put back in his place. For a moment, he is this great central figure, the organizer, and then all of a sudden, he's on the other side of the door again. The leaders are in the room talking about this, and in Jane Triber's book, she actually references the fact that Revere's sort of asked to guard the door from the other side. And so Revere's position, he's a lieutenant, not a general. And we're reminded of that. So he goes to Watertown, where again, he's involved in a number of things. They're starting to print some currency there, and he brings his family to Watertown with him, but he's not the central character anymore. And then he moves on to the train of artillery, and his military service is not all that spectacular. So he does this shift, which is both ironic, but probably tells you a lot about the ways people's lives really play out.
And again, I think to give him credit, because he comes out looking more positive, except when you hear the word court-martial, it's never a positive thing. But one of you briefly just tell the story of his later military experience and how that led to a court-martial and how he was cleared, his name was cleared at the end.
Yeah, so Revere, as Nina says, really does have a really frustrating war, especially once he enters it. He holds out for this continental position that doesn't come straight away. And I just might add, incidentally, in Watertown, one of those interesting kind of life trajectories is they're living with Henry and Lucy Knox for a time as well. So we think about these figures interacting in Watertown, and of course, almost you could not have more dissimilar military careers in the Revolution than Knox and Revere. The passing of the night, but Revere ultimately ends up in the Harbor Islands. He's at Castle William for a time, running essentially a thankless position. Revere could not have known this. Obviously, no one knew this at the time, but essentially after the evacuation of Boston, really after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the war starts to move south. Boston's role is done for the most part, so there really isn't a direct pipeline for action in the close vicinity for Revere. By the time the Penobscot expedition comes to the fore, a couple of failed, nothing comes of them, a couple of failed missions down to Newport. They give him no honors. By the time of Penobscot in 79, he's still looking for this military glory. Long story short, the mission is one of the largest failures for the Americans during the Revolution. Revere is leading an artillery train there. The chain of command breaks down, and essentially the Americans are trapped in a totally untenuous position when the British fleet's able to sail into the harbor, close things off, and the Americans are essentially pinched in. The command control breaks down. Revere is ultimately charged with cowardice and insubordination, but the command structure is unclear on where his where the buck ultimately stops, how quickly people need to make maneuvers. And I think Revere ultimately made the decision to get both his gear, personal gear, and more importantly, his men to safety in Boston. So he returns to Boston. It's a disaster for the Americans up in Maine. His command returns more or less intact, but upon arrival, we get this real bevy of he said action in Boston. Revere is placed under house arrest. He's stripped of his titles. Ultimately, the house arrest ends, but Revere, for years, really, we're getting into double digits the number of times he pushed in different capacities for the court-martial. He wasn't court-martialed by someone else. He's pushing for it to clear his name, which ultimately happens. Now, the upshot of that is, of course, this takes years. This takes a great hit to Revere's reputation. It takes years away from his business. And of course, it ends any potential for other military action for Revere. So though he ultimately gets to a place where he accepts the language coming out of the ultimate court-martial, he really has to do a full reset on, to some extent, his reputation, but certainly his businesses, which he does, but takes a long time and really is more or less, you could say, a decade of setback for Revere coming out of Penobscot and his military efforts.
And again, once again, his reputation is varnished, not tarnished, but varnished by Longfellow. But there's a Longfellow connection to the Penobscot expedition. Can you just comment on that?
Well, Peleg Wadsworth
Right.
is one of the commanders who Revere bumps into. And I have always found it greatly ironic that grandson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, then writes this poem that elevates Revere. So his grandfather thought nothing good about him, although I have this vision in my mind of Peleg with little Henry on his knee saying, boy, I really said some bad things about that Revere guy. He really wasn't that bad. But we don't know because Longfellow never references that I know of Penobscot or his grandfather. So we really don't know. It's just my thought that it's either a delicious historical irony or someone using their grandson to say, I'm sorry.
So the Revolutionary War ends, and at least I think I have the timing right. And his contribution, though, to the U.S. military and the Navy is quite substantial in terms of being a supplier of copper sheets. Maybe one of you can just comment on the role he played there and the timing of that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a right juxtaposition, Tom. That certainly the revolutionary history for Revere is not great after the Midnight Ride, but the contributions that he makes to the War of 1812 are of lasting and great significance to the United States in the 1790s as the nation's working to form its first navy. It's the navy and its first ships at what was a critical moment in the United States as the country is being torn between the old enemies of Great Britain and France. The United States needs a navy. It puts the navy together. Revere's there in early stages at his iron foundry in the North End as he's producing mortars, some ship fittings for these ships. But most importantly, and this gets to the autodidact part, he's able to really put his neck out there on the line and learn how to ultimately succeed in opening the first copper rolling mill for the United States. Previously, the United States had been importing and needed finished products from Britain, which of course is a very embarrassing situation to be in as you're trying to come into your own as a new nation. But Revere is able to secure government loans, bit of a bumpy process there. Revere was a Federalist himself, so he worked with relative ease during the Washington, but then more importantly, the Adams administration. But following the election of 1800, just as his copper rolling mill is getting started, there's a transition in the politics of the United States. So he finds the Jefferson administration far more difficult to deal with in terms of ultimately getting the money that he was promised. He's able to do so after several petitions, and he's able to outfit some of the first ships, the USS Constitution, with copper sheathing, which allows for faster ships. It allows for less time in dry dock, scraping off barnacles and the accumulation of sea mats at the bottom. And ultimately, these kind of long-term ones, and Revere's still alive for the War of 1812 himself. He dies in 1818, so he sees the full duration of the war. The United States had some of its great and only successes in the Great Lakes and in naval battles at the start of the war. So his ships certainly helped the war effort in general and really helped the United States keep the War of 1812 going in some of the really early, ominous-looking years of that conflict.
So I thought I'd just, as a last question, Nina, you've spent most of your career at the Paul Revere House, and Robert, you're fairly new, but you must have an anecdote or two about things you learned or interactions with tourists, and I thought it might be a fun way to end, to ask you to share one or two of those if you're so inclined.
Well, there are a couple things. I mean, it's always interesting when we talk about the Revere family and he had two wives. Visitors always say at the same time. It's as if they want it to be at the same time. It was not, but that's one. The other thing, which is just sort of a generic house museum, is there was a father who pointed to the chamber pot under the bed, which is shaped sort of like a coffee cup. And he says to his son, boy, they had big coffee cups back then. My favorite one, my absolute favorite one, and this was a question that was asked of me. Person looked at me and said, now tell me, when was Paul Revere president? Before or after George Washington?
A great question.
Throw up your hands and say, I don't even know where to start with that. That's
a great question.
All-time question.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting it's an interesting question, Tom, and I'm glad you've asked it. It starts to bring back these memories as obviously we're looking to reopen in the not too distant future, and I think really makes me think how much I think we've all missed that component, right? Is the interaction with the visitors. They're why we're here at the end of the day, and having some of these some of these connections. Even some of those questions are the ones that really keep us going some days. I think one of the more striking ones to me, which in some ways gets to a lot of the questions you've asked here tonight, was a New Zealand couple that came in when I was in the kitchen. Looked around. This was in the winter, so we had time for a lot of direct conversation. They just looked around and said, "Why am I here?" They know the general name. They know they're supposed to be here, but it's both an existential and a literal question. Why am I here? So I think some of those moments are the most gratifying when it's somebody who knows they're supposed to be there for some reason, but you can get into some of these deeper questions and especially with international visitors make these connections about why certain houses in America might be here, what's the story there, what's the story of the revolution, and actually ended up being a more fruitful conversation than perhaps their first query would have led on.
My mother's health is failing, and I happened to be in Maine last night. She texted me, "Are you in Maine, Massachusetts?" So I thought when I arrived this morning, I'd send her a few pictures, and I drove to the North Bridge. It was just this beautifully stunning morning, and I took a picture of the bridge, and it really is stunning that we can be here. That we can be in these places that hold this history, and I'm sure this is why people flock to your site. I mean, there's nothing different. I mean, nothing can replace being in that space and thinking, these people walked here, or this battle was fought right here. So for those viewers who are watching, we're now going to turn to your questions, which I hope you have been sending in via chat during this session. And Robert and Nina, we're going to change formats slightly when we go to questions, but we thank you for watching so far, and we hope you'll stay with us while we do some brief questions and answers. But Robert and Nina, let me thank you for this conversation. It's been quite fun, and I look forward to continue it with the audience questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Good. Nina and Robert, can you hear me? And I think the audience can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, your audio is a little tough.
A little garbled, but
yeah.
No. That's shoot. Well, let me. Is it still garbled?
Yeah, I'm having trouble with the audio.
All right. Let me see. I think what I'll have to do is get out and then back in. Let me try to do that.
Sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I can what if I mute?
Why don't you talk a little bit and I'll come back in a minute.
That sounds good. Nina and I can vamp for a minute. We're glad everybody is here, and as you can tell, we changed up our look since the last time we were on too. No, you're still on mute, Nina.
Okay. How about that? Can you hear me now,
Yep,
Robert?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, we're a little, we've cleaned up our act.
There we go.
Can you hear me now better?
Perfect. Much
Okay,
better,
good.
Tom. Yep.
Well, I was going to joke that it feels a little bit like we all just jumped into a telephone booth and changed our outfits, and here we are again. Nina and I stuck with the same background. Robert, you actually look far more scholarly tonight. Your role.
Change things up.
I introduced you both as having a combined 36 years of experience at the Paul Revere House, not so evenly divided. You certainly know how to keep a job. We want to welcome everyone who is here with us from the Paul Revere Memorial Association. Nina and Robert extended invitations to them, and really what a wonderful partnership we have between the North End and Concord. And again, we welcome everyone to come visit the exhibit. So continue, please, to send in your questions via the chat. And I thought I'd ask, we have 3 interesting questions. I thought I'd ask them at once. They all have to do with, was Revere at? Did he participate in the Tea Party? Did he play any role at the Battle of Bunker Hill? And did he meet or have any interactions with George Washington when Washington was here in the Cambridge, Boston area? So I'll let either of you hit on one of those 3 questions.
Sure. Yeah. Tea Party, probably, but we don't know for sure. And the Tea Party is, I think, different from the Boston Massacre, in which it's very unlikely. But in both cases, we can't say with 100% certainty he was there. For the Tea Party, I move towards probable for a few reasons. There's a lot of crossover and carryover between his groups, the individuals he was working with, and kind of the demographics of the Tea Party lineup more for, I think, probable in Revere's camp being there. Further, there are post facto references to both Joseph Warren and Paul Revere physically being there. These were ostensibly popular ballads that existed maybe even in Revere's lifetime that were kind of popularized definitely by the 1830s and then printed in the 1870s that kind of highlight him as one of the leaders of the artisans and the mechanics, which we know he was. And I think it would make sense that he was there. So probable, but we don't know with 100% certainty that he was there. In terms of Bunker Hill, again, as Nina mentioned in the talk, it's one of those, it's the 75 period, we don't have a whole lot of information on Revere. Presumably he was still out in Watertown. He wasn't at the battle with, of course, his close friend, Dr. Joseph Warren, so was not a participant in the battle there. And for Washington, again, one of those things where certainly in that 75 period, I don't think though he was later part of some of the groups that were able to meet with Washington when he did his tour of the North during his presidency. But we don't have that, that smoking gun piece that they interacted directly.
Great. Similar question I'm going to combine two. Someone asked about the accuracy of the N.C. Wyeth painting, which is in the exhibit. We hope people will come see it. Is it based more on what really happened, or is it based more on Longfellow's poem? And then a couple interesting questions about the Copley portrait. Why was the portrait painted? What role has it played in creating the myth of Paul Revere?
Well, I think with most of the portraits and paintings of the Midnight Ride, they're based on the romantic imagery of the poem. And I can't speak to Wyeth's particularly, but I think most of them are. And in fact, they show him generally shouting, which we know he didn't do. And they are based on that wonderful romantic imagery that the poem really leads you to: a single rider, a dark night, the single person really having impact. So I would say most of those images really do that. With regard to the Copley painting, that's a great question as well. We know that Copley and Revere had a relationship, and we know that Revere actually made some frames for Copley, and Copley chose to show Revere. They sort of made to be as if he's in his working class outfit, but he's actually dressed much better than he would have been when he would have been working, and he's got a polished table in front of him. So it's sort of a representation of a working class person, but not really. And we don't know whether Copley approached Revere and said, "I'd like to do a portrait of you," or whether he owed Revere money and he did it. There really is no clear evidence. Why Revere would have paid money to have a portrait like that done seems unlikely at that time in his life. We do know that the family didn't really care for the portrait later on. In fact, it was put away. And there's a wonderful painting of Revere that was done by a family member that's the Copley head with Revere in a continental uniform, which was apparently how the family wanted to remember him at one point in their life. But now certainly the family sees the value of that wonderful Copley painting.
So this question says, our church, which is outside of Boston, has a bell that was made by Paul Revere, but you haven't talked about his work as a foundry. Did he make a lot of bells? And maybe just comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, he was quite prodigious as a bell maker. Both we've actually been doing some more work internally on the bell project. I might just shout out our recent intern from the spring, Alex Spice from Northeastern. He's a master's student there who did some real tremendous work in what was obviously a very challenging time here as everything went remote halfway through, but started to use some mapping techniques to give a spatial spread of Revere's bells in New England. So you can find that actually on our website, on our recent Revere Express blog. You'll see that posting there and see certainly abridged content, but some of the geographical spreads of Revere's bells that were coming from the foundry. So certainly there are quite a few locally, and then really they ended up around the country as well. We didn't get a chance to talk about it quite as much in the chat there, but a really incredible output. And again, it's one of those things where he decided just to go for it. His church, the New Brick Church, needed a bell in 1792. He said, "I'll give it a whirl. I can do that." Never done it before. He made it. There were some initial hesitations about the quality of the first bell, but he stuck with it and cranked him out after that.
And one of the other things with regard to bells is that the Ed and Evelyn Stickney, who went out and searched out every Revere bell that they could find, it was an avocation. They have both passed away, but we took their archives and we are working on doing a republication of their bell book, which is a list of all the bells. And then there are some that weren't in the last publication that they did. So we're getting ready to republish that at some point in honor of the Stickneys, who were really the folks who put Revere bells where they needed to be in terms of information.
So speaking of churches, there's a question about, was he a religious person? Did he attend church himself?
Yeah, he was a lifelong member in the North End at the New Brick Church, so he was religious himself. We don't, unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of Revere, he kept the records of his work. We have the meticulous records and entries on his waste books and business ledgers, but we don't have a whole lot in terms of personal reflections to really be able to delve into his faith life. But he was both certainly a regular participant in the church and was quite active in the parish life, as it were, both in terms of committees, and this certainly a little bit later in his life. We're thinking 1780s into the 90s, and as seen just by that Bell example a moment ago, was literally invested in being a pretty active congregant to his faith community.
Great. To the audience, please keep your questions coming. I said we'd go about an hour, but I think we can go a little while longer. I'm realizing that unlike if we were in the Lyceum, people leaving is somewhat distracting, but here you can just leave and none of us have to even know. So for those of you enjoying the question and answers, we have more, so we might as well keep going. So this question, we touched upon it slightly, but the questioner says, I want Paul Revere to remain the brave soul he was the evening of his ride, but subsequent to that ride, I wonder if it was class issues that kept him out of, quote, acceptable heroic society. The first, I don't know if you agree with the premise of the question, but we talked about kind of class preventing him maybe from rising, within the social strata, but how about his memory? Was his social class, did that affect the way people see him as a hero or not?
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think for people who are really interested in seeing a bootstraps kind of life effort, he looks like a self-made man. I think some people find that heroic and they really like that. I think there are other instances where people find flaws in Revere. The flaws that we find make him more human. They find the flaws and then they think that should make him less of a hero. So if your heroes have to be perfect, Revere can't meet that standard. If a hero can have some flaws and be someone who is a self-made person, then he retains his hero status. So I think how we like our heroes is might define the answer to that question.
Speaking of flaws, this person's asking, in light of contemporary issues swirling around us, whether Paul Revere had any slaves.
No, so the Reveres never owned slaves, and to the best that we can piece together from contextual evidence, and again, this gets to the question of sources for Revere. There's a letter that he has with or an exchange, a one-sided exchange that we have with a former friend from Boston who had moved to the South. And we have the friend side of the letter who's writing to Revere in 1785 that essentially says, don't ask me any questions about my plantation. I plan on owning slaves. I plan on having a plantation. I don't want to hear from you. I know what you're going to say on this matter, and we consider it closed. So we only have this one-sided kind of half source for Revere, but I think one can perhaps tease out, at least anecdotally there, that at least in the 1780s, when some of these debates around the Constitution were percolating, Revere, we know, was not a slave owner, and it seems was, through this contextual evidence, perhaps anti-slavery and his own personal sentiments.
And how about the question of, on the kind of continuum of rebels, there were some who were more moderate, you might put John Hancock there, and some who were more radical, you might put Sam Adams there. Do you have a sense of where Revere was on that continuum?
I always view him as sort of a pragmatist in a way. We do know that up until at least 1773, he was still making silver items for folks who were either Tories or wealthy enough to afford things. And he made a wonderful set of gunner's calipers for a British officer. So as a businessman, he was sort of balancing, I think, his need to provide for his family, the economics of the time period with a move toward revolution, that wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a swing over a period of time. And then at some point where push comes to shove, Revere is where we find him riding to send the alarm. He's a passionate person, but again, the lack of those personal documents, it's really hard for us to know exactly where he was on those things. But I see him as pragmatic. Robert,
yeah, I
have a
would.
different opinion.
No. I would definitely agree with that. And I think the one source that I would look to on this question, where we have some of the clearest articulations of Revere's political economy and his views of the revolution, come in letters to a couple of family members, specifically on the Isle of Guernsey, on the Revere side of his family. So we're going to the French Huguenot side, in which Revere really outlines pretty strong, very passionate anti-British take. Now, I think that the caution here is that those letters come in 1782, right? So it's a much the die has been cast at that stage. The war is essentially over at that point. So number one, it's a lot safer to be writing those. And number two, we have, even then, he had the benefit of hindsight. So we have these letters in 1782 in which he clearly stakes, we would say maybe even fairly radical positions, but we don't have that smoking gun from the earlier period. And I would totally agree with Nina. If you look at his ledgers and voice books, which we do have, it doesn't really matter which side of the conflict you're on. He's still willing to do business.
So Robert, I'll throw this one to you, and you're going to have to give a little context. But the question is, was there any suspicion of Dr. Benjamin Church at the time? But maybe you give a little context before you answer the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Church, in one of the letters that we do have from Revere, from his kind of post facto writings about some of the organization for the Sons of Liberty, Dr. Benjamin Church was kind of in the sanctum sanctorum, as it were, for some of the Patriot leaders and the Sons of Liberty in Boston in the early stages, 74 into 75 in particular. Revere and his mechanics, he said, would split off into groups of 2 individuals, 2 by 2. At night, they would do patrols on the British soldiers, see their movements, and he had listed Benjamin Church as one of 5 individuals that this information would be conveyed to directly, and only these few individuals, Adams and Hancock, being amongst them. As it turned out, Dr. Benjamin Church was playing both sides. In fact, he ended up, by almost all accounts, being a spy for Gage and the British. Ultimately, in the early Republic, there was really no mechanism to charge Church with this action. He's ultimately put into exile to leave the country, and the ship vanishes. So his story and his side of the story ends at that point. In Revere's later reflections, again, it's a little bit hard to always take him at face value, writing so much later than the fact. He said that there were maybe some inklings that Church was, something was amiss with Church. And I think more specifically, he said his best friend, Dr. Joseph, or his very good friend, Dr. Joseph Warren never trusted Church. Warren always thought something was off with Church, though Church had presumably hoodwinked a good deal of the leadership otherwise. So from what Revere said, Revere was iffy, Warren was always suspicious, but the other leaders much less so on Church.
Great, we'll do just a couple more questions. They're getting a little more specific. So Nina, this is your friend, Tom Chambers. How did Paul Revere die and where?
Well, he died at a wonderful old age of approaching 83, which was wonderful for the time. He died in 1818. He had lost both his son Paul, his eldest son Paul, and his wife Rachel in 1813, which we think was a deep sadness for him, but he still lived a number of years after that. He died, we believe, in Boston. That seems to be what the records tell us. He had a home in Canton near the copper mill. which was kind of his vacation retreat. But I also think he liked to look over his son's shoulders at the mill, even after he retired. But he also had a home in Boston, not the house that we show, but a house on Charter Street, which was lost. So he died of apparently old age. He was not that ill up until that time. And hi, Tom.
All right, I have one more question, then one thing to wrap up, and then we'll say goodnight. So this is again, very specific question. Do we know if Paul Revere ever visited the Henry Knox house, General Henry Knox's home, Montpelier in Thomaston, Maine?
That's a good question. I would, we don't know, I think would be the straight answer. And I would also think that would be highly doubtful later in life that he was trekking up to Montpelier. With a lot of things Revere possible, but I don't think we know that with any specificity.
So Nina, I always enjoy your ability to tell an anecdote. Maybe I think you told me one about a more modern, contemporary Paul Revere and a run-in with a police officer. Can you maybe close with that story, and we'll say goodnight to our.
I would love to. This is a story about he was our board president, has since sadly has passed away, but Paul Revere Jr. Was driving through Lexington and Concord, and he was pulled over by a policeman. And the policeman came to his window and asked for his license and registration, handed them. And Paul said the policeman stayed for quite a time in his cruiser. And he thought, what's wrong? Something wrong with my registration. What is it? And finally, policeman comes up to his window and he sort of sighs and he said, Mr. Revere, I can't go back to the police station and tell people that I gave Paul Revere a ticket for speeding in Concord. So I'm going to let you go with a warning. Take it easy on your way home.
Well, if people were headed on their way home, we would wish you well, but you're already in your homes watching this program. We thank you. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Allison, for organizing us. Thank everyone for their patience with a couple of technical snafus, but as our first virtual forum, I think it was a great success. So thank you all very much. Happy 4th of July and good night.
Paul says good night.